And I have some problems. I don't know, when I begin talking, the internet doesn't want to hear me. So maybe I will move to another place. So if you see I am moving, it's because internet. Well, this is a seminar. The 25th seminar is in honor of Eugenia Correa. And we are happy that all our friends and colleagues and students are in this seminar. And today we are beginning the second day of the seminar with Gary Dymski. This is the fourth conference, the Conferencia Magistral, and the title is Intersectional Inequality and Global Economic Governance, the Self-Feeding Dynamics of Asymmetric Power and Wealth within and across national borders. Thank you very much, Gary. Oh, I don't have in my hands your CBU a little. I just forget it. So, okay, I give the floor, please, Gary.
Thank you. I'm going to load the page now. Let's see. I believe it's this one. Maybe this is better. Okay. Can you see?
Yes, yes.
And now, does it go now kind of, come on now, full screen? Good. Okay. So yes, it's an honor and a sadness, but a necessity to be here and to honor our friend and dear heart, Eugenia, with this memorial, as well as participating in the continuing tradition. And I have a small special introduction because Eugenia was someone special for all of us. And in some sense, her passing is before her time, but she was somebody who lived in time and with history. And actually, I think of her in that way because she opened so many doors of understanding for me. And I would mention in terms of history that one of my favorite evenings ever with her was when she took me over to Eugenia Martinez's house. And we sat in her living room and drank tea and talked about the PRD and the many conversations leading to the founding of progressive left politics and party there in Mexico City. And so it was something that Eugenia treasured, and I'll try to bring a little bit of that history. And in particular, we were not quite the same age, but Gregorio and Eugenia and I are maybe of the same generation. I think Toporowski is in there with us, and Mario as well, perhaps. And for us, this year, this symbol you'll recognize. Of course, we're looking at. Let's get Sergio in there. We're looking at, 1968, and 1968 was the first year in which I marched in a demonstration. It was a march against the war in Vietnam, but this was a year that had these events there. And of course, in Mexico, you had these events, but then I think, maybe equaling the combination of civil rights movement and war in Vietnam for me was the activism there in Mexico. And of course, we think of the Tlaloco and and then we think of those days. And there we are in a kind of a very funny picture in UNAM. And I would say, in some sense, I found this quote by Octavio Paz, and when I think of Eugenia as an intellectual, I think of her, not only is she grounded in history, using history to try to understand, theory to understand, but Octavio Paz, we could change the gender, but what is he searching for? Perhaps he searches for his destiny. Perhaps his destiny is to search. I think for people of our generation, who were formed by activism and by the need for change, who are now still seeing the need for change, I think that we were motivated especially by this search, the idea that we were searching, the economics was a vehicle, the political economy was a vehicle to make some change. And of course, drenched in history, and history is there. We cannot escape it in Mexico, of course. And, in the end, what we leave behind is our words. When we saw Jan speaking yesterday, and behind him was those bookshelves of the precious words and books that he's carried forward. We believe our words behind the next ones, our students, as Alicia and I were saying, and for the ones whose destiny is also to search, as it's ours. And there's a copy of my copy of Labyrinth of Solitude, and look at the legacy of words. Look at the words left behind, the clues that this amazing person has left us. Okay, to the talk. Okay, so this is an experiment. I was encouraged. I've been trying to think of how to bring together my work on stratification, intersectionality, inequality, racial inequality, and gender, and so on, with the work on financial crisis. And this is an experiment along those lines. Jonathan Perrotin was at my talk last week, and he saw the kind of evolution of some of these ideas that I'm still playing with, how to make things fit. In any case, let's go through it. What we have here is a kind of a summary that I think there are feedback loops between intersectional inequality and financial crises, that national governments in the West are standing between these force vectors, right? On the one hand, the demands for stable returns made by owners of globally mobile capital, right? And then their citizens and residents' need for well-being. These two vectors pull them in opposite directions. And what we see is the increasingly frequent and severe financial crises that since 1980, when the neoliberal era begins, 79 if you're living in this country, in Britain, that we've seen that this has forced these sovereign governments, on the one hand, to reassure markets and mollify the IMF by providing bailouts, etc. And on the other hand, these policies and these practices needed to sustain, the global standing of the nation states, the flows of globalized finance and wealth, are different to those required to preserve communal well-being for the mass of people. Increasingly, there's conflicts. And as these states' capacities ground down, more of their residents seek income or new lives elsewhere. So with this, we see this unbalancing of the conditions for stable income earning and public good provision in destination nations, the nations where people go. And because that's happening, that worsens conflicts there over resources that play out across historical intersectional divides of race, ethnicity, and national origin. So blaming the other becomes more central in national political discourse. Elected governments can no longer satisfy their population's demands for material well-being, and they instead pursue policies in many cases that validate this intersectional rage and need for revenge. Revenge on what? On history, on your circumstances, on your class, on your government. Those in subordinate rungs of the stratified society, because of race, ethnicity, gender, and so on, they're squeezed hardest as welfare cuts, unemployment take hold. And this treatment is justified by the idea that, well, they're the undeserving poor. They deserve no protection from market forces. In fact, the hell with them. So those who hold this intersocietal positional power, when reminded about this historical roots of exploitation, they dismiss it as identity politics, right? Their reward is for taking this position is no longer material advantage because their pension funds are drying up, their employment, their wages are being cut, their kids can't get jobs, and they're suspicious of everything. No longer material advantage, it's vengeance. So the focus, and in this discourse, we see even the well-meaning, but let's face it, not innocent work of economists like Angus Deaton, who talks about the increasing death rates of white men in the United States. Okay, Angus Deaton, but let's put this into context. So, and these ideas that it's we can't permit these risky homeowners, these people of color, to become homeowners. And this is said in lies told by Calamirez and Haber. Okay. So state interference with market processes is then seen as the source of the crises. And so let the markets work, right? Purify society by punishing the unworthy. Throw them out altogether if you need to. Do whatever is necessary. So, stratification is a way of efficiently identifying subaltern groups whose consent is not needed for political control, who can be suppressed, oppressed, and simultaneously, this stratification identifies those who can provide the insecure, low-paid labor for the economic growth machine, or, if they're not needed, who can be discarded on society's margins. Many of the latter of these, of course, joined this floating workforce of migrant laborers. The political disenfranchisement of those, the invisibilization of those most victimized by declining state services makes financial crises less costly for elites. Loosened controls on finance, of course, make them more likely. The inability of governments overloaded by bailout-related debt to restore formal levels of national well-being feeds this politics of anger and blame the other dynamics. Violence against minorities and migrants substitutes for and is sometimes read by cynical participants in politics as class solidarity. Okay, now briefly, let's visit what the mainstream makes of all this. This dual dynamic, this dialectic that links external market forces and internal social political divides is ignored, of course, in what I appreciate Jonathan remembering that expression of the shape-shifting mainstream models of financial crisis. Here, Jonathan, we'll just do them very briefly. We started with the Latin American and East Asian crises. We said, well, it's moral hazard. These borrower nations are bad actors who will default if you give them the chance. But as the crises multiply, we see the IMF and other players get in there and do more thinking, and they start to say, well, there's second generation models of currency crisis that focus on the financial markets, not so much the borrower countries, and maybe sunspots, beliefs that can lead to cross-border stops in lending. But then the next step was taken by Borio and Ray. They argue that financial openness in this world of deregulated, market share hungry financial funds leads to global financial cycles. Monetary policy has no effect. So if we think to that famous impossible trinity notion that states can choose two of the three. They can choose independent monetary policy, fixed exchange rates, and or open financial markets, but not all three. Well, no, actually that's dead. There's a dilemma now, not a trilemma. Your only choice is how open you're going to make your economy to financial flows, whether or not you're going to have capital controls. And so indeed, Ray, who's written a lot on this, she has this very curious sentence here, but very telling when she says, in one of her writings, she says, well, I believe in the neoclassical growth models behind many of our economic intuitions. This is bowing down to the mecca of belief of the mainstream regarding why the free flow of capital could be beneficial. Within this model, financial integration brings improvements in allocative efficiency and better risk sharing. Really, Helene Ray, the air must be very clean over there in the London Business School, a little bit differently from SOAS, I suppose, where Jan works. Okay, so what then triggers financial cycles? Well, the shortage of safe assets. Caballero and Krishnamurthy and others argue that there's a global excess demand for riskless assets. And foreign savers can find them in the US, and that explains why we see a US current account deficit, and then that overloads the US market, so it explains also the excessive risk-taking in US financial markets. Occam's razor, right? Just blame the shortage, the inability of sovereign nations outside the US to actually create safe debt. And meanwhile, they also explain by excessively expansionary monetary policy, the excess financial elasticity of domestic policy regimes, exacerbates doesn't allow the monetary authorities to stop financial imbalances or financial cycles. That's Borio. So instead of shortages of safe assets, keep in mind that safe assets view, as Ray points out, although she's not the primary author there, but she participates, that's really, a classical view of macroeconomic dynamics. Well, Borio is a little bit more Keynesian. He focuses on market imbalances and excessive risk-taking. There's even a hint of Minsky in there if you look at it the right way. But let's get real and just notice, we're looking at the global scenario, and it's just global, global, global. There's global flows nobody can stop. Well, let's take a look at the structure here, and let's just go with the IMF's duo of Levin and Valencia, who've written now several papers where they're describing and categorizing financial crises of all kinds, currency, debt, and sovereign debt, and so on. And well, basically, what we see here is that it's actually a shortage of global safe assets that explains cycles. Financial crises are thus not to be explained. They're providing like a seedbed of unsafe assets. They tell you where people are trying to escape from to set this real dynamic in motion. I'd say, oh, really? Let's take a look. And let's just count up. And what we see is that there are 99 episodes recorded by the IMF duo in Latin America and the Caribbean, many more than elsewhere. Now, what you need to do then is just to notice these special things. Of course, there's the Latin American debt crisis. There's the subprime crisis that hits Western Europe in particular. Eastern Europe, counting just the 90s, arguably can throw in the 2000s, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and then, of course, there's the East Asian crisis. If you remove those special events, you still get that Latin America is 3 times more financial crises than anywhere else. And really, what is it about financial crises? What is it about Latin America? And that's kind of where I'm going to go with part of the thinking here. Now, just a page to say that in opposition to this notion that we can blame these useless people who are subaltern in the stratification structures. Let's just remember here that we see these ahistorical and seemingly naively behavioral interpretations of both developing country debt problems. Oh, it's borrower nations have moral hazard. Oh, they're bad borrowers. And then regarding those seeking racial, ethnic, and gender rights for equal provisioning, and treatment, those are just people joining together in rent-seeking coalitions. These are just facades that people who are convenient for the power elites throw out there to get on television, get big grants, and allow the others to hide. But let's just remember, in these last part of this screen only, and so much more to be said, that developing country risk on the one hand and subaltern positions in stratification structures on the other hand inside the countries reflect histories of power and control, especially by imperial powers taking land and needing labor when they're building their edifices of exploitation and plunder. So from African labor needed for the American plantations, South Asian labor needed to produce goods for the English dining table, to the Irish and Eastern and Southern European labor needed for America's industrial revolution, to the Southern black labor that was needed in the growing northern cities. People and lives have been replanted for gain. And it's convenient to consider that when the plantations no longer require that stoop labor, or the factories that inner city labor force was there to serve have closed, or when the fields that the farmhands are no longer need the farmhands, well, we can just say, well, it's obvious that those who are here now, those subalterns, must have come here for the easy life, since they're clearly surplus people with deficits in skills and education. This is easy victimization, except when, right, they can't breathe. All right, now, the global architecture of power and finance. Let's go now to this alternative understanding we're going to try to develop here, just to say that we're going to flip from the new classical framework of Caballero and Ray to a post-Keynesian framework, and we're going to take into account power. And especially we're going to focus mostly on cross-border, but also taking a look inside the nation states. I won't beat this to death here, just to say that there's a debt to Sheila Dow and Vicky Chick, and Richard Pete has a nice book in geography on the geography of economic power. And so let's move on and basically just in a page, which some of my people who've heard me speak won't believe, the architecture of power and finance. We have this triple banking crisis in the 1980s in the US, where the US Federal Reserve demonstrates the will and capacity to support insolvent big US banks. Too big to fail was born and has been kept ever since as policy. Now, at the same time, the U.S. current account was in deficit, and that means a capital account surplus. This is all based on the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar and the fact that people needed a safe haven, so it was convenient with the structure of global finance, or financial flows and good flows. This has been a stable neoliberal structure. It has conferred positional power, specifically the ability to define the rules of the game, on the US, of course. Deregulation across the advanced countries permits the rise of and global penetration by a US megabank-centered shadow banking system. You have wannabes, and then you have the Deutsche Banks who think they're going to rule the world, and then they don't, and the door opens, and there's Goldman Sachs, or there's JP Morgan Chase at your doorstep. So what we have is what Jean DeRista has called a global pyramid, wherein only one country at the top can stop crises when they occur across borders. So there's these global holdings of US liabilities that support global financialization, that allow the American consumers to live beyond their means, so to speak, and increase pressures that destabilize governments and increase the returns to financial predation and speculation. Now, where the money goes depends on where the opportunities are, in part, better growth and asset bubbles, but also on where the global macroeconomic structural imbalances are. This is where the macro comes together with the financial. And in particular, I want to highlight the significance of the secular stagnation of the advanced Western nations as they left the global financial crisis and they put the brakes on their spending. We had 10 years of austerity, arguably more, in the UK and so on else in many other places. And basically what this has done structurally at the global level is to turn developing economies from current account surplus to deficit. And in fact, here's the picture. There's the advanced economies in gray. This is current account position across all economies as measured by the World Bank in dollars. And what you see is there's the emerging market and developing economies going from surplus to deficit structurally, and the opposite happening for advanced economies. Of course, corresponding to this picture, if we look at the international investment positions, we see as well that the advanced and emerging economies have flipped position too. That's the other side of the coin of that realm. So there's this asymmetric privileges of dollar dominance, right? This hyper leveraged financial system has room for only one king in the monetary kingdom. So the US, backed by its international lender of last resort, its Fed, and by its fiat money currency that sits atop the global hierarchy and offers a safe haven, this allows it to finance to be the global consumers of last resort, even after industrial dominance was lost. And the thing is that, the more prominent we see the so-called market-based financial system, the wholesale money markets, the super leveraged positions, the dollar-based commodity trade, the hedging practices, all this based in dollars, the more insurmountable seems the US dollar status and the US, the financial power. So other sovereign nations can measure themselves, and there's a list, how much can we use our own currency? Do other people hold it? Can we settle contracts? But basically, lacking financial status and not being the king generates financial fragility. So basically, this means that to overcome this fragility, you got to maybe look for another direction. Build a current account surplus or build up your reserves. And that takes us to actually the other pole in the global system, another way of moving, which has been the rise of Asian capitalism. And here we're going to talk about the first and second rise of Asian capitalism, just again in a couple of slides. What we see here is this global pyramid of financial power was, is joined by, originally, kind of stands aside the previous measure of power, which was manufacturing power. Now, the UK lost it, and so did the US by embracing deindustrialization, the so-called global factory. But Asia was filling the gap. Japan's state-led growth initially leads the way. Long story there. The Cold War has lots to do with that. But as Japan shifts from low cost to high cost wages and production, its firms engage in FDI with other nations in Asia. They're spreading knowledge, hiring workers, building factories via network firms that are reinforced by urbanization and improving education. This, from the outside, this paradigm is seen as a mercantilist winner-take-all with intra-Asian gains from trade enhancing Japanese influence. Or you could look at it that way, or as Kojima put it, it's a harmonious mechanism of collective advancement by means of consecutive catching up efforts. However you look at that, basically prosperity comes to Asia, and as it does, Japan's rapid growth threatens US supremacy in particular, and let's call it G7 other than Japan supremacy. So there's conflicts that emerge over the unfair advantages as perceived from the outside. And here's just an example. There's the Japan that can say no, Ishihara's famous book, von Wolfram's famous book, and Japan is number one. So what happens to the first rise of Asian capitalism, and here we're going to finish with Asia right now, is that basically Japan agrees, is they're called to a meeting in the Plaza Hotel, September 1985, the Plaza Accord. They agree to raise the yen's value and to invest domestically. They do that, their banks refocus on domestic investment, leads to a land bubble and a stock market bubble, and then a collapse of Japanese housing and share prices. So Japan goes into a long stagnation. Meanwhile, with a high yen, this accelerates the shift of Japanese foreign direct investment into its flying geese partners, which in turn leads to this rapid urbanization and industrial intensification, attracting overseas lending, especially from the US and Japanese banks. That then leads, due to domestic speculation and foreign investors' sudden stop, to the East Asian financial crisis. And this is where China really enters the room. China rescues regional GDP by maintaining its demand. China was then growing, building its special economic zones, attracting FDI, and they increasingly have built their own system and made Asia into an ever more integrated global production consumption hub, dominating global manufacturing and dominating global supply chains. Here's just a picture that shows you the rise of, in black, East Asia, a major part of which is China, but Japan is in there and others too, and showing you that elsewhere in the world is declining. So global shares of manufacturing, there's your measure right there. Now, and global manufacturing indeed is now China-centered. We're going to do India in a few minutes, and I just want to point out that India is here along the wrong side of China just because they wanted to do a swirl. And notice, and for our purpose, notice that Mexico and Brazil in this picture are very far behind. And for that matter, the US is just more than half the Chinese total, and Germany is a fifth of that total. And of course, this has led to more books like these, Death by China, The Coming China Wars, by this marvelous fellow, Peter Navarro, who was Trump's trade war advocate. And so that, there you go, we'll leave him where he sits. And I just got a couple pictures here showing various measures of trade flows. And just as we saw Latin America relatively isolated from the center of global manufacturing, I want to show you too, just that, basically here's an UNCTAD picture. Latin America doesn't figure much, and we're going to focus in on the Latin American financial trap here in a couple of minutes. And it doesn't figure much there. Here's a different picture. Again, this is a trade between 2015 and 2019. What this picture does is to show us in green something that's growing. The width of it is the size of the flow in these years, 2015 to 2019. The color is whether it's growing or the same or shrinking. Green is it's growing. So all those corridors growing. And then, but again, you can see that there's not much. There's that Mexico link. There's a NAFTA effect. But going down into Mercosur and so on, there's not much going on. And you see that nexus there in East Asia. Now, if we continue on, this is the Boston Consulting Group doing their picture for their publicity purposes, I suppose. What we then see is as they look forward, what they imagine is that the China-US connection will weaken, but they also see other connections being stable or going down. And there's China, of course, building on its empire. Arguably forward, there's another discussion there, not our topic today. Now, what this gives us, this comparison of the financial core and the manufacturing core globally, is the idea that, well, I called it before a neoliberal global triad. Well, I don't know about that. You know, the dollar, the mega banks, and the global factory. So one position is the financial core, the US itself. The other extreme is the manufacturing core, East Asia, especially China. They're interdependent, of course. And we can measure other nations by their distance from these two poles. And we have this extensive peripheral margin whose member nations have risks of both kinds, fragilities provisioning and financial fragilities. So we can make sense of places like the Philippines and so on along these dimensions. Now here, what we need to do then in understanding especially the global financial challenges, is to go a step beyond Minsky. Minsky, of course, is thinking about units having cash flow carrying capacity problems. But, you know, country risk is there. The possibility that loans made to borrowers within a nation might not be able to pay. And then exchange risk, the possibility that the value of the assets in a given currency might lose value because of the movement of global exchange markets against it. And keep in mind, the high currency, low currency problematic is much transformed in the age of global supply chains. So basically, you know, nations near or at the core of either pole are arguably immune from speculative attack, but other nations are exposed, especially to global financial fragility. They can be the targets of gotcha games by speculators. So they have to accrue some power, some defensive power, either inward capital controls, require the productive use of foreign capital, or build up especially excess stocks of foreign currency reserves. Now, defensive power then is defined as here by, you know, thinking of this idea, protection from speculative attack, the power to be left alone. And you can see examples then of countries that are building up excess reserve stocks, which would be irrational, except as a backstop for defensive power, right? So essentially, now here we go. First of all, we're going to do Brazil, Mexico, and India. And I've got it measured two different ways. First, we'll start with current account balances. And what you see is basically all three countries, and obviously picking three major countries from the global south, basically whether measured in terms of billions of US dollars or percentage of GDP, they've all experienced, these are the most recent, fresh this morning, IMF pictures. And what we see here is that these are nation states that have been in current account deficit. And so there's that. But now take a look. So you're in current account deficit, which means, right, that you are basically needing, if you think of a current account deficit, it means you need to either spend down your reserves or attract capital from overseas in order to finance your deficit. Those are the only two options. But check it out. What you see here is that there's a buildup of reserve assets. This is India. That means that you're going into debt in order to get more reserves. Same thing in Mexico, different scale. Same thing in Brazil. Interesting, huh? And actually, these same patterns, we worked it out. Nicole Chirpa and I, my PhD student, we worked it out. These patterns obtained for all of Latin America. So this, this subordinate global position of Latin America here, primary exports exported to this imperial center, underdeveloped industrialization is, part of the pattern here. So Latin America remains trapped in uneven development is where this leaves us. So we have the inadequacy of its nation's ability to accumulate capital. We have its dependency on exports from core countries and on the US dollar. And there's a peripheral position along both financial and industrial dimensions, combined with their continued dependence on exporting commodities, leads to extremes of wealth and poverty and ever-increasing financialization. This is just a picture showing you that same pattern of current account erosion and reserve assets building across all of Latin America, and exactly the same pattern, again, if you sum across all of Latin America. So the two arms of the Latin American financial trap are these. The current account deteriorates and oscillates wildly due to this dependence on commodities and so on. And on the other hand, these nation states' weak currencies, they've built up stocks of reserve assets. Meanwhile, the global mega banks and their shadow banking empires play a guard labor role. Globalized financial firms will implement financial attacks to take gains from nations exposed to global financial fragility, or to make bets and take from whoever is willing to be a victim in a gotcha zero-sum game. So essentially, nations have for the nations themselves, they have to overborrow to protect themselves, build up their reserve assets, even when their current accounts are deteriorating. Now, just keep in mind, it's not the poorest nations that are targeted here, it's those in the middle tier. And this is, by the way, one legacy of the Latin American crisis, because we saw there the launching of the marketized Brady bonds, which made Latin American countries in this niche an asset class. So, Borio, his argument doesn't apply. Latin American central banks have been prudent. The banking systems actually have been remarkably crisis-free, but it is exposed to the free movement of excess financial capital looking for bubble-driven growth. And actually, the U.S. doesn't just provide safe assets, Claudio Borio, or actually I should say Caballero. It maintains its pole position on the financial axis. To do that, it requires that it backstop its mega banks. And these mega banks and the hedge funds and investment entities and funds around them are, ensuring that they're going to sustain the unsafety of nations outside of the dual global power nexus. So actually, the U.S. is kind of in a unilemma category. It has to maintain low interest rates and absorb unwanted financial assets and sustain liquidity. It's not a choice. It's what the Fed's doing every day now, if it's going to maintain its position at the center of global financial power. And this power is exerted by action at a distance. Like hedge funds and other speculators will just ride the bubble and do what they will. Now here, I've got a curious picture, and I'm going to just, I guess, be brief here, just to say that what we see, this one is actually wrong. Sorry for that. Essentially, what we see, if what we see is a story through the 2000s of basically the higher you are here, then the more you're devalued. And just that we see Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and South Africa fighting to maintain. Now I know that that low traditionally, and this is the new developmentalism, maintain a competitive exchange rate. But let's just look at what's been happening in these years. 2007, on the right-hand side here, was set to 100 for all of these. We're setting South Africa and so on, on the other axis. And what we see here is that basically, yeah, for a while it works, but no, that the value of the currency is slipping away. And of course, Venezuela explodes. Venezuela, right, becomes like a test case, like don't act right, and this is what's going to happen to you. So basically, we have here a situation of contradictions and that are structural in both the global West in both the developing countries in the global West and in the advanced economies. In the developing economies, financialization increases in everywhere, but this is just buying time. These nations' ability to provision for their people is threatened, even spiked by conflicts and geopolitics. So, and you see the rising political repression, scapegoating, fueled by movements that in some cases deny objective reality, like Brazil's right now, and undercuts the basis for democratic compromise. So flows of refugees and economic migrants rise. Meanwhile, in the advanced economies, governments cannot reassure their embittered citizens, cannot do that. They can't extend human services to all, keep guest workers out of the country, and also supply labor-intensive sectors with low-wage, disposable labor. They can't do all that. And so this encourages the rise of nationalist anti-foreigner movements across the global north, right? Like ghosts are coming out of the closet, the ghosts of the Civil War lead in white supremacy in the KKK, National Socialism in Germany, etc. So those in subaltern positions in the stratification structures there are being forced to relive histories of ethnic and racial violence, exploitation, and oppression. And this, of course, blocks any global response to climate change or to enhance human provisioning. The situation is beyond emergency. And this is just a couple of pictures here on the way out the door, just to show you that what we have are increasing remittances, increasing flows of people for economic purposes. And to conclude then, I think this is my second last slide. I've got a couple others just for a bit of saudade. This post-crisis mainstream literature argues that deregulated flows of global finance are an unstoppable force, limiting the autonomy of national economic policy. But they don't consider the structural features of the global macro-financial system. Why? Well, they're not Keynesians, and they're not paying attention to stratification of social power. Latin America's subordination in this mix is a consequence of the asymmetric structure of global financial power in the midst of a world system with a polarized structure of global manufacturing and trade. The support pillars of this dual center system, which creates and recreates global financial fragility and imposes stagnation and losses on people throughout the world, that is the global mega banking system and the key currency central banks, that system, those pillars remain in place even as the political foundations of that global order give way. And let's just end, and I would say, and let's think of Eugenia and say, remember history, remember struggle, remember your commitment, remember what you're doing, and let's never forget. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks. It has been great, this conference that you have given to us, and especially because you have the map of the world. And I think this is very important, not only to see one region, but all around, and what financiation has done. And especially one of the things that I take, and then I will give the floor to our colleagues, is how Latin America and all other countries are building financial barriers rather than infrastructure in Latin America. This is amazing. When you see the ECLAC reports, one of the last reports of last year, when they were seeing that our health system and education systems are, well, they have the budget to health and education have decreased a lot. At the same time, they don't want the deficits. They want to have a superávit. And there's a side, there's a paragraph in that report where they say that Latin American countries, instead of giving of doing more investment, they have decrease the deficit. So that is amazing, and that's why we have a lot of problems. And I will take one of other problems that we are seeing right now in Mexico is the migration problem of the Central American crossing Mexico to arrive to USA, and they are also making a big, now it's a huge problem, because one of the things that sometimes people don't understand, and they are very neoclassical to understand these issues, is that they have been using the term forced migration.
Yeah.
It isn't forced migration. If you see the reports of the country reports of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the IMF is doing a huge, how can I tell you, a huge hole in their economies, because they have been lending and they are improving the austerity programs. And besides that, they have all these climate change has impact a lot with hurricanes and also they have decreased their commodities. So, and they have an informal economy. It's like 60% of is in the informal market in Central America. So this has made, and the other part that it is that nobody wants to talk is that when they cross in the caravanas or they cross to Mexico, the problem is terrible because the American dream finished in Mexico.
Yeah.
And that nobody is aware of this, because in Mexico, you have all the criminalization. And I don't say the crime economy, I say the parallel economy, because it's a parallel economy that works perfect with the formal economy. The state and the crime and all these drugs that came from Colombia or other parts, then they go through also to Mexico. And the problem that we are having right now is that the Mexican policy for the migrants, it isn't the best one. It is really when you go to see the shelters where they are, the people, and now all with the COVID, it is a very sad decision. And well, I like your paper. It's very interesting. And other thing that I would like to point is how China is the manufactured country, but there's one thing that we must say. China is not a market economy. It's not a democratic economy as the way we think it's a democratic, but they have reduced poverty, and they had a plan since the reforms of the Deng Xiaoping during the 80s to have a vision of more than 3, 4, 5 decades. And that's why after the great financial crisis, they recover a lot. And now with last year, it is the only country that didn't have negative GDPs. With this, I finish, because it is, you have pointed many interesting things for a seminar. So I give the microphone for the floor, and if somebody would like to have some comments.
Actually, we have Jan in the chat, and I think let me see. I think that's Jan asks. He says, Gary, you suggest that it's politics that is driving developments. Is it also the economy that is subordinate? Absolutely. I meant to imply both. That's kind of the idea that we carry our history with us, and that thinking about the people who are in subordinate positions and stratification, these are often we think, I mentioned briefly in the paper, people who are, let's say, minorities living in inner cities like Detroit, who their labor is no longer needed. Well, their labor was pulled there by the industrial machine back when that was a machine. That's the similar kind of problem that we have in the north of England, right, with cities like Manchester and so on, and Sheffield and Bradford, where the migrant labor was needed, and the working class labor was needed, and now it no longer is. So in some sense, there's this interaction between the way that the politics plays out today and this kind of historical legacy of the movement of labor and the movement of capital through time. I was in thinking about this idea of the poles of finance and manufacturing. I was thinking like a little bit like, just as I'm kind of stretching Minsky to think of the cross-country aspect in some sense, if we can stretch Keynesian real time to be a little, kind of historical time as well, it gives us an interesting perspective. We've got.
If somebody would like to raise your hand, make a comment.
I see Iris. Go ahead, Iris.
Well, I'm sorry because I haven't practiced my English a long time ago, but I want to know, looking at what's happening in the globalization period and how it has destroyed a lot of economy, how it's making the poor more poor and the rich richer and less rich. What do you think of an old idea of planning the economy, not changing the system, just having an economy with a mixture action like private and public for planning the economy? For me, it's the only solution I can think now, because like in most of Latin America and Mexico, the condition of the working class, that sometimes is not working class, is like Marx used to say, it's a labor force that couldn't obtain a job. So I'm thinking that perhaps that's the only way to increase the levels of life. And like in Mexico, we need invest in public education, invest in health. But if you don't say you can't waste, you have to, you can't increase your debt, it's very difficult to change the situation. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I completely agree with you that we cannot stay where we are. Actually, Jan Toporowski is on the call, and Jan is a specialist in a debate that occurred largely in the mid 20th century about and then later carried on when Eastern Europe was shifting out of the Soviet bloc, about how to do that, whether to have something like, planned economy, some features of socialism and, collective goods, or, how could that be done? And the fact that there were, it's not that you're moving from day to night, but you can think comprehensively about what are the social needs, what are the investment needs, so that people don't waste themselves and then take chances or get into debt for jobs that will never exist and that they'll never be able to repay. So there's where, Alicia's point about the planning aspect of China's economy is something that we have to, or the longer term vision is something that we have to acknowledge. And in that competition between East and West, if you call it that, that would be something the West could learn. One thing is that, things have gotten so, I had so much to talk about that I didn't get into the conversation about how to finance the Sustainable Development Goals, or how to deal with climate change. When I was last at UNCTAD, which was November 2019, the staff there had produced a figure of $3 trillion as the amount needed to deal with climate change and SDGs. It's a big number, 3 trillion. On the other hand, 2 points. One is that the global economy is 90 trillion. And secondly, I did some comparison, and actually when Keynes in the 20s was criticizing Lloyd George's plan for British recovery from I guess it was the 30s, from the Depression, basically it worked out to about 3% of the overall economy, and Keynes was like, it's way too small. And so in some sense, there's a scale problem and a need and desire to say, yes, there are human needs, there are things to be done. We have the means and capacity, but we need the will. And this idea that paragraph that Helene Ray sticks into her discourse, where she says, oh, by the way, I agree with the neoclassical growth model because it can be more efficient allocation. That's why we need free capital flows. We have to, fight that very, very strongly, because at this point, as Alicia was saying, the only thing that the financial sector globally is serving is itself, and reproducing those cycles of bailout, excessive wages. Okay, now we're doing leverage loans. Now we're doing GameStop. We're doing whatever we're doing. Now it's this steel magnet guy. And these games are there for those who want to ride the bubble, the insiders, to make their money. But that's all sucking the capacity out of, because of the tax shelters and the losses and so on that will accrue. It's sucking the capacity out of governments to play their role. So now, what will it take for us to move to a better and saner position? This remains to be seen. Certainly having a sane and mildly democratic president like Joseph Biden is an improvement on having an insane megalomaniac like Donald Trump. But that's just the first step in to the journey we need to go on.
Okay.
Gary, thank you very much. We're very happy that you have prepared your paper as Eugenia has discussed it with you until today. Well, now we are moving to the next conference. Here is Rodolfo Garcia Zamora, who is going to be the moderator, and also is Pepe Dennis, who is going to talk about Latin America. So, Rodolfo, ¿quieres tomar el micrófono?